My name's Steve Jones from Huber and Suhner Cube Optics. Pleasure to speak to you again with so much knowledge and experience in the room. Just a little bit first about Huber Suhner Cube Optics, just going from the bottom up. So we're a Swiss-German organization. You can tell by the accent, I'm not from that part of the world. We do things such as components into transceivers, all the way through to passive and active muxes, and splitters, and very much things at the plumbing level. So we're going to keep things here at layer 1, because that's the stuff I understand. So for 400 gig market, this slide is just basically saying that it's growing. It will continue to grow. This is something that people probably already know. In terms of form factor, we're seeing QSFP-DD as probably the form factor of choice going forward, but there's always buts. And these are some, because we like to keep things simple within the optical world, right? So these are some of the 400 gig transceivers that are available, and I know that there's some people in the room already offering 400 gig on the client side to some of their customers. But I'm very much going to focus around the ZR side of things for this presentation, and more specifically around the modulation used on 400 gig transceivers. The world is definitely going IP over DWDM, so there's many people, knowledgeable people who are suggesting that we won't need transponders in the future, and that's probably true, but like most things, it's when, because there's still a need and transponders are still required, but from a cost point of view, it makes absolute sense to remove the transponder and just go a colored optic into your switch stroke router, spending too much time in America, and straight into your passive WDM system. I was luckily I spent a bit of time in Dublin last week, and the wonderful people at INEX, Nick Hilliard, did this slide, so I borrowed this from Nick. And this is what's happening now with regard to optics. So rather than just have one laser, you've got a number of things going on within constellation. And this is what a 200 gig 16 QAM constellation looked like if you felt like analyzing it. Going forward, this is what a 600 gig 32 or 64 QAM constellation. And Nick's advice last week was squint a bit here to look at some of the little green dots on the periphery, because that can create a problem. Can create a problem. If we look at a 100 gig, this is a DWDM. This is all DWDM systems. Every vendor uses exactly the same. We're looking at the C band, so basically you've got 100 gigahertz. So we get gigahertz and gigabits. I have to think about. So 100 gigahertz spaced, but it's not a straight line, as you can see. There's a slight curve here. It's all taken to the midpoint within 100 gigahertz, and 40 channels, away you go. But you actually get 50 gigahertz within that 100 gigahertz space to pass the data through, which at 10 gig and 1 gig and 100 gig and so forth is not a problem. As we saw earlier, as 400 gig becomes more widely deployed and 600 gig as well, the best way to do it, as we've talked about, is over a passive DWDM system. But the coherent laser width is 50 gigahertz. Some, as we saw earlier from the constellations and the QAM and the modulation used, slightly exceeds that 50 gigahertz passband. It uses, you might need up to 75 gigahertz passband to make sure you get that whole constellation through. And a 75 gigahertz constellation will give you enough passband for it to work. And of course, you still have to keep your existing services running, be that a 10 gig or 100 gig or or whatever else you want to use. So you need to keep that going, and they'll still work within this 75 gigahertz passband. So you've got two options. You have two options. You can use 200 gigahertz spaced DWDM muxes, which is what INEX chose to do. So if you have an 8-channel mux at 100 gigahertz, you're typically cutting that down to a 4-channel mux. It does limit, you can't really have a 40-channel mux at 200 gig. I guess you could, but it'd be really complicated to do. Or option 2, or option B, whichever you prefer, is to start using 75 gigahertz space muxes, because I'll re-emphasize that they'll cover all the 400 gig ZR plus requirements and 600 gig on some of the other vendors' equipment. But you can still have a 40-channel mux if you wanted. But if you want 40 channels with 400 gig, that's a lot of traffic to transport around the place. Plus, of course, you keep your legacy systems running. Does all of that make sense in a lightning talk? That's the... what have I done? As I say, my name's Steve Jones, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Seemingly, I have questions. So I understood what was going on, but you didn't actually say what the symptom was.
Sorry. Yes, the symptom was, thank you very much. The symptom was that whilst the circuit came up, the issue was that there was high bit error rate. So there was the bit error rate was more than the service provider was willing to or able to work with. So thank you very much, Anne. That was a very, very good question, and I should have mentioned that earlier. So thank you for asking the question. Bit error rate wasn't good.
How did you tell what the bit error rate was?
The customer decided that they looked into it, and when they eventually, via they're looking into the problem, they discovered this was the problem. So the INEX discovered this as an issue. On their, it was a 600 gig service in that instance, yes. Thank you.